In this module, I'm going to talk about some of the implementation details of how you actually implement organizational change. In Unit 4 on release planning, we discussed OKRs. So briefly to summarize, OKR stands for Objectives and Key Results, where objectives are a clear statement of your goals, your intent, and the key results are the measurable outcomes, which are the necessary and sufficient conditions of your objectives being met. You gather OKRs from your key stakeholders, including your teams, and then you prioritize them. OKRs can be set at the team level, they can be set at the business unit level, they can be set at the organizational level. And you don't have to have a kind of direct one-to-one mapping between all of them, but it is important that they are in some way connected to each other. So in the literature on lean thinking, there's this term called strategy deployment, or Hoshinkanri, and it talks about how to take objectives and push them down into the organization and then build feedback loops to inform future strategic planning based on what actually happens at the lower levels. And this is sometimes called catchball or Hoshin planning. And the idea is that you set objectives at the organizational level, and then at the business unit level, based on those objectives, you set business unit level objectives, which don't need to exactly correspond, but should be based on the organizational level objectives. And then at the team level, you set your OKRs or your target conditions based on the business unit ones, but specific to your team. And then as you're executing those, you get feedback on whether they're going to work and achieve the desired outcome, whether you're not going to have time to do them, and that information will feed back up to the process of setting objectives at the next level up. So you're going to have this kind of feed down thing of objectives and direction and true north, and then kind of a feed up of what we learned in the course of trying to implement those objectives through continuous experimentation. So this process is a way of achieving alignment across the organization. It's a way of creating feedback loops through the organization, and it's a way to try and make sure that everyone is aware of what the strategy is and that they're working towards it. And crucially, that we have feedback loops. If you set an objective and it produces unintended consequences which are negative, or it's unachievable, or we find all kinds of obstacles that are hard to overcome, often because they require concerted action at one of the higher levels in the organization, that feedback needs to get back to where it can be acted upon. So it's important to create these planning processes, and what you'll see is in some organizations, the lower level planning processes happen on a shorter cadence. So the org level objectives might be set annually or semi-annually, business unit objectives might be set quarterly, and then the delivery objectives might be set monthly, so that you can get those feedback loops and actually inform the process at the higher level more effectively. And because those objectives at the higher organizational levels will necessarily be less granular and less precise. The other thing that's important to bear in mind is that you don't want too many objectives, especially at the org level. There's a book called The 4 Disciplines of Execution, where it says that if you set 11 to 20 challenges, you will achieve none of them. If you set 4 to 10 challenges, you will achieve 1 to 2. The best thing to do is to try and set 1 to 3 challenges, and then you have a chance to actually implement those. So you're much more likely to see those objectives achieved. And this is really all about capacity. Again, in Unit 4, we talked about capacity planning and making sure you're allocating sufficient capacity to do improvement work and organizational change work. Capacity is always limited. Teams never have enough capacity to do all the work that's necessary. That's why you need to make sure that you allocate capacity for delivery work and for improvement work, so that there is sufficient capacity to get things done. But then you also need to limit the amount of stuff you do, so that there's a chance that some of those things will actually get done. So making sure you're allocating capacity and making sure you're limiting the amount of work that you try and put through the available capacity so things actually get done. I do want to talk a bit about the experimentation piece. So we talked about an experimental approach to product development where you have an objective, which might be an increase in conversion, and then you design a feature and you test the feature by building an experiment or getting user research to find out if that idea is actually going to work. It's the same thing with improvement work. In the Improvement Kata, Mike Rother describes 5 questions that you should ask every day as part of your capacity set aside for improvement work. Firstly, what's the target condition that we're trying to achieve? What's the actual condition now? What obstacles are preventing you from reaching it? Which one of those obstacles are you addressing now? What's your next step? The start of an experiment cycle. And then how quickly can we go and see what we learn from taking that step? And this should remind you of running experiments for your products, because fundamentally it's the same process. In the lean literature, you will see this term PDCA. And PDCA is known as the Deming cycle or the Shewhart cycle, and is basically an expression of the scientific method, which is that you make a plan, you execute that plan, you see what happened as a result of that plan, and then based on that, you act accordingly. And so this is basically saying we're going to have a hypothesis and we're going to design an experiment to test that hypothesis. We're going to run the experiment, we're going to check the results, and based on the results, we're going to modify our plan and work out what to do next. And so all that the Deming cycle is saying basically is you have to run experiments. There's also this other concept in lean of standards. And what a standard is a description of how a process works at the moment. So often in organizations, a standard is how we think the process should work and not how it actually works. It's important in lean that a standard means a description of how the process works right now. And so what happens as a result of process experimentation is we find a new way to work that's better than the existing way, and so we update the standard once we've established this new way of working so that it describes the new way of working in the process. So this is just a way of communicating how things work at the moment. And the idea is that once you've got a standard, you can keep it, but then you're going to continue experimenting to find ways to improve your processes and how you work. And again, there's a lot of description of capabilities that we've discovered that are effective in software delivery, in the research program that I've been working on, which you can find out more about by going to cloud.google.com/DevOps. I want to end by talking about one of the discoveries we made in that research program, which is about how to actually take good ideas and spread them through the organization, which is very important. It's one thing to discover better ways to work on your team, but you've got to take those better ways of working and spread them through the organization, which again, in the NUMMI story, part 2 of the NUMMI story was about how GM failed to do that. They found improvements in one plant, but they couldn't spread it to other plants. Again, you're only going to achieve systematic improvement if you can take things that work and implement them throughout the organization. What we find in our research program is that the way to take good ideas and spread them throughout the organization is by building community structures. Elite teams favor strategies that create community structures through mechanisms such as building communities of practice, by building grassroots movements around particular ideas like effective testing or any good idea, by trying out proofs of concept, by taking ideas and experimenting with them, and then using those to create templates that can be used through the organization, or by using them as seeds for further experimentation. So what is a community of practice? Well, you can Google it. There's lots of good information. I recommend checking out Emily Weber's talks and her book on communities of practice. I've got an example from Google. So there's a lot of information on how Google works. And one of the things that we're quite well known for these days is by being pretty rigorous about automated testing. But Google wasn't always like that. We didn't have a culture of comprehensive unit testing in particular. And that was something that was not built by a top-down order where leadership said, go and do unit testing. Instead, what happened was there was a group of volunteers who thought about how to do unit testing at Google and tried a bunch of things out and spread that information throughout the organization. And this group was called the Testing Grouplet. So you can read this article on Martin Fowler's blog. It's actually a very long article by Mike Bland about a number of things, but there's a whole section on unit testing at Google and how it was implemented. And this link goes directly to that section of the article. Mike Bland says, the Testing Grouplet was a team of Google developers who worked together in their 20% time, which is capacity that Google sets aside for you to work on things that you're passionate about, in addition to your main project, to address the challenges in promoting unit testing adoption throughout Google. It was an all-volunteer group with little funding and no direct authority, relying on persuasion and innovation to convince Google developers of the value of unit testing and providing them with the tools and knowledge necessary to do it well. So it was a volunteer effort, and they invented all kinds of fun ways to try and persuade people in the organization of the value of unit testing. And one of these programs was called Testing on the Toilet. What they did is they had a monthly newsletter and they printed it out on a piece of paper and then photocopied it and stuck it to the back of all the doors on the toilet cubicles in all the Google campuses. So you could literally never escape from finding out about unit testing at Google. Every time you went to the bathroom, there would be something about testing in front of you. So it was a campaign that was put together by this volunteer unit that didn't have direct authority or funding. They just used that extra capacity that they had to find ways to experiment and spread information throughout the organization. And it was very, very effective. That's the reason we have this unit testing culture at Google now. So this emphasizes, firstly, the importance of setting aside capacity for improvement work. Secondly, creating the kind of organization where this can happen, where you do actually encourage groups within the organization, volunteer groups, to experiment and share their knowledge, which relies, by the way, on psychological safety and effective leadership. And finally, for the people who are doing the work to actually feel that they can try things out. And so in the spirit of Radha Narayan's guest lecture, I'm going to end with a quote from Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, who says, "If it's a good idea, go ahead and do it. It's much easier to apologise than it is to get permission." And I hope you work at organisations where this is possible and encouraged, and I encourage you to go and do that. That's it. I hope this has been valuable. Thanks very much for your time.